All right, it is 7 o'clock, so we're gonna go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everybody and say thank you for joining the Crested Butte Mountain Heritage Museum for the first installment of our speaker series celebrating National Preservation Month. Next week, we have Molly Miniman and Jesse Early, same time, same day next week. They're going to be discussing the rehabilitation of the Denver and Rio Grande Railroad Depot in Crested Butte. Registration is live for that event, so please visit crestedbuttemuseum.com to sign up for that. At the end of this session, there is going to be a very short survey that provides feedback to the Crested Butte Museum regarding the content that you guys want to see. We want to make sure that as we move through this new and interesting time that we're providing the information and the education and the programming that you guys want to hear about. A huge thank you to our members for your support. And for those of you that aren't members, consider joining to be the first to learn about programming like this. Thank you to Dwayne Vandenbush and Ian Billick for speaking today. This is the first in our speaker series. And today is about the efforts to preserve Gothic, Colorado's historic townsite and buildings by the Rocky Mountain Biological Laboratory. If you guys have questions, we are going to have 15 minutes at the end of today's session to answer your questions. So if you all find the chat in your Zoom, so for all of our participants, find the chat in your Zoom and place your questions there. And we'll be able to get to them at the end of this session. With that, I'd like to introduce Dwayne Vandenbush, Colorado historian and professor at Western Colorado University. And he's going to give us a short history on Gothic, Colorado.
Thank you, Nell. Gothic is located in a very beautiful spot right where the East River and Copper Creek come together, about 9,400 feet in elevation, and a beautiful Gothic mountain towering about 3,000 feet above it. The early white people who came into the area were placer miners, and they existed in nearby Washington Gulch, near a town later on that would be called Elkton. But a lot of placer mining was done up near the top of Schofield Pass on the East River. And a lot of the placer mining also engaged in right where Gothic is today. Anytime you got water coming off the mountains, that carried free gold. And by free gold, I mean it didn't need to be smelted. It was shot, wire, grain, flour, dust, or nugget you put in your saddlebags and ride away. That decade was in the 1860s. In 1874, as part of the great surveys of the American West, sponsored by the U.S. government to make the first scientific survey of the West, Ferdinand Hayden, one of the four explorers, stood on top of Mount Teocalli and looked in the distance and saw two mountains that he named the Crested Buttes. Later on, they found out that one of the mountains more resembled a Gothic cathedral. So they named it Gothic, and they dropped the S off of Crested Buttes, and that became known as Crested Butte Mountain. So Hayden is the man who gave it the name. One of his men, Sam Emmons, has Mount Emmons named for him just outside of Crested Butte where Red Lady Basin is. In 1879, silver miners began to come into Gothic, and only 26 families stayed in Gothic during the winter of 79 and 80. And one of the guys who provided a lifeline was a mail carrier from Crested Butte named Louis Barthel. And Louis Barthel's daughter said one time, I've often known him to carry a 5-gallon can of coal oil and a 50-pound sack of flour besides the regular mail. Tremendous avalanches came off of Gothic Peak. And Barthel's daughter said, we used to hear the loud roaring and watch the huge slides that came down off the mountain across the river from the town. The peak of Gothic was 1880 to 1882. By then, it had about 1,000 people in camp and another couple thousand people in the surrounding area. It had two hotels, the Olds and the 3-story Gothic Hotel, which had a total of 32 rooms. Gothic also had a couple of smelters, 3 papers, the Elk Mountain Bonanza, the Gothic Miner, and the Silver Record, 3 sawmills, many stores, 14 saloons, a city hall, and a lot of rich investors that came in to look that area over. The Gothic at that time was known as the city of silver wires because of the wire silver it had. It was also very important early as a transfer station from the ore being brought over from Aspen to the railhead at Crested Butte. Aspen, the #1 silver town in the world, didn't get a railroad until November of 1887. So burros called Rocky Mountain Canaries with 200 pounds of ore on their back came up Maroon Creek, over East Maroon Pass at 11,800 feet, down Copper Creek, into Gothic, and then to the railhead at Crested Butte. And that went on for 7 or 8 years. And then those burros would be loaded up with supplies from Crested Butte and brought back into Aspen. And there were about 400 or 500 burros that did that on every trip. Also, a passenger and a mail line ran over East Maroon Pass, which had at Copper Lake stables, a dinner station, a corral, and a small boarding house. In the winter, bobsleds and sleighs were used. A highlight of Gothic came in 1880 when ex-President U.S. Grant came into town, and he was welcomed by a blast of powder and a band that announced his arrival. He stayed that night at the Gothic Hotel and then moved on, going north up into Schofield and eventually down into Carbondale. Promising silver mines now began to be found around Gothic, and the richest of them all was the Sylvanite, about 3 miles up Copper Creek. But others, including the Whopper up at the head of the Crystal River, the Terror by Maroon Creek, the Luana up Brush Creek, Rustler Gulch had the Mountain King. All these great silver mines in and around Gothic. Every evening at Gothic, a big bonfire was lighted on the main street and a huge crowd would gather. And what happened was you had a brass band that would play, foot races would be held, fights would be held the following day on Sunday. If 2 guys had a problem, there was a fist fight attended by the entire town on the main drag of Gothic. And one of the interesting stories was a racer from Gothic, a very fast man who had never been beaten, was in a big match race with a guy from Crested Butte who was also fast. And when the people from Gothic found out that maybe the Gothic runner had fixed the race to collect on some bets, they threatened him with death if he didn't win. And needless to say, he was able to win. In 1881, a man by the name of Charlie Cregan started the Congregational Church. And the church had rude wooden slabs laid on blocks. But Gothic was kind of a wide open town in those early days, as a lot of the early silver camps were. Charles Avery, one of the guys who was one of the early investors and for whom Avery Peak is named, died very early in 1883, and I'm quoting from the paper, from a fall over a precipice near Gothic where he had been for 3 years. He fell 350 feet, recovered, went to Chicago, died, and when he died, he was worth a couple of $100,000. The top mine in Gothic, and one of the top 5 in the history of the Gunnison country, was the Sylvanite, 11,700 feet in elevation up Copper Creek. It turned out over $1 million worth of silver. And Robert Strayhorn, a traveler who visited there in 1880, said this: "In all the openings, the richest silver ore I have ever seen in large masses is the Sylvanite." Gothic also was the center of many of the exciting snowshoe or ski races in the early days, when people from a variety of towns nearby would compete against each other for pretty good money. One of the races came in 1886 in Gothic, 1,900 feet long, right off of Gothic Peak, won by Frank Williams of Crystal in 22 seconds. Very steep shot. Gothic began to go downhill around 1885 as the price of silver began to plummet. It eventually bottomed out at 58 cents an ounce in the silver panic of 1893. Gothic also never did have the high-grade silver ore. It also was rather isolated, and it was hard to get ore to a smelter. So all those things began the downfall of Gothic. Lou Waite, the editor of the Silver Record, left in 1888, and he said this: "After living on wind pudding, Copper Creek soup, Gothic scenery, and promises of bummer subscribers, I left." Jenny Crawford kept the record alive for a while, but finally she grew tired, she said, of snowbanks and living on rabbit tracks. So the papers began to shut down also. A few revivals were made around 1903 when a new smelter came to Gothic. Up at the head of Rustler Gulch, a new powerhouse was put in 1908, 36 feet square, and a mill down below. But despite these efforts, things began to go downhill in Gothic. One of the legendary figures of Gothic was a guy named Garwood Judd. Garwood Judd came from Ohio. He was born there in 1852. He came to Gothic in 1880, and he'd gotten a one-year education in geology at a great school in Ohio called Oberlin. In Gothic, he served in many town positions. When Gothic became a ghost town, he became a caretaker, and he delighted in showing people around. He had clippings he would show them, ore samples that he showed them, stories that he told. And when Gothic became a ghost town, he became known as the man who stayed. In 1928, the Fox Film Company made Judd the subject of a two-reel documentary called The Man Who Stayed. He died at 78 in 1930, and his ashes were scattered at Gothic. And finally, Dr. John C. Johnson, a member of the first Western State College faculty in 1911, visited Gothic for the first time in 1919, and 9 years later established the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab as a research station. Even though he went on to teach at Westchester State in Pennsylvania, we had the stipulation that he would come back every summer, which he did. And the first summer session opened in 1928. And eventually, and Ian will probably talk a little more about this, the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab bought the hotel, one of the hotels still standing, and that was used as a dormitory. And later on, they bought the town site for back taxes, $200. And that is where I leave it. And now it's a great pleasure for me to introduce Ian Billick, the Executive Director of the Rocky Mountain Biological Lab in Gothic, who's going to talk to you about the rehabilitation of the historic buildings in Gothic. Ian?
Yeah, thank you, Dwayne. It's a little intimidating to give a history talk following Dwayne, but I'll do my best. One of the things that is fun about working in Gothic is just how much oral history there is. I first started in Gothic in 1988, and I worked with Chris Johnson, who by that time was a senior scientist, and it was his father that founded Rumble, and Chris knew Garwood Judd. Garwood was there in the early 1880s, so there's a lot of oral history going back. When I became director at Rumble in 2000, I got a phone call from one of our longstanding members, and he said, "You know, I taught ornithology in Gothic in 1929 and haven't been back since, but I've loved that place, and just want to let you know I'm still watching everything that's going on." So I've been able sort of through the years to accumulate a lot of photographs and a lot of stories. And what I thought I would do tonight would be to share some of the old photographs I have, and then spend a little bit of time talking about an unusual story that brings historic renovation and biology together. That was the first preservation project that I was involved in back in 2003 when we renovated the old town hall. So I am now going to share my screen, and if everything works right, you will see some photos. So let me get the slideshow started. Okay, so I'm going to go back and show you just a few shots of the history that Dwayne was talking about. When he was talking about the town being founded as a sort of a boom mining town in silver, that's what we're looking at on both the left and the right. And as he noted, the Hayden survey came through in the early 1870s, and they looked up at Gothic Mountain and thought it reminded them of the Gothic cathedrals, and so they named that Gothic Mountain. For a short period of time, Gothic boomed, and as Wayne mentioned, however, after the price of ore dropped, the town started disappearing pretty quickly. And Gothic, on average, gets about 450 inches of snow. And a big year, you'll get maybe upwards close to 700. I think there's one year that Billy Barr recorded that was about 660 inches. And that snow, that amount of snow really beats up the building. So if you're not out there taking care of those facilities, the town site starts to deteriorate pretty quickly. This is a photo that I think dates sometime after the silver boom had sort of died off, but before RMBL was founded. And you can see kind of on the right, not the first building, but the building just behind it, below Bellevue Mountain in the background, is the Gothic Town Hall. And that's the building I'm going to talk about a little bit later. And the Gothic Town Hall was one of those original buildings that dates to 1879, 1880. Gothic was founded in 1928. This is a shot of everybody who was there in the Gothic town site in that first year, sort of the Gothic census. Chris Johnson, who I worked with in the Rumble Library, I think has got the blonde hair on viewer's left. You see a bunch of little kids right there. He's next to the twins, which were two adopted boys that John Johnson and his wife had adopted before they had Chris and Clea. And that building that they're sitting on is the hotel, the Gothic Hotel that Dwayne was referring to. And in the background is the Swallow's Nest, which is a building that's still there. And it's kind of an iconic figure when you look through old photos. Typically, if you're perusing old photos, you can see both the Swallow's Nest and the town hall because they're right there on the main road.
Hey, Ian.
Garwood Judd. Yes.
We're seeing just the first slide with the townscape. So I think have you clicked onto the next slide? There we go.
I did on my computer, but apparently I'll do it this way
Okay.
since it looks like the screen show is not working. Thanks for the heads up, Nell.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'll just review quickly since you weren't looking at what I was looking at when I was talking. So that's the this is what Gothic looked like after the silver boom sort of died off and before Rumble was founded. And now if you're looking to orient you below Bellevue Peak on the right side of the Gothic Road, you can see the Gothic Town Hall. And you can sort of see the stairs starting to go up. And off in the distance with some white trim up on the hillside is the Swallow's Nest. And that building is still in Gothic. And it's kind of an iconic building because it sits up on that little knoll. You'll see it in a lot of the historic photos. And then this is the photograph that I was showing of all of the people that were in Gothic in 1928. And down on the left side, you can see the three little boys there. Chris Johnson, who is the son of John Johnson. And then they also had two adopted sons, Clarence, and I forget the other twin's name, that both served in World War II and were never came back from World War II. Chris Johnson, their brother, also served in the Battle of the Bulge. And fortunately, he came back and served as director of RMBL for about 10 years. I'm pretty certain that on the left, as you look at that photograph, the person in the suit is Dr. Bean from Germany. We have one of my favorite buildings is called Bean Pod, and it's a little building. You can touch both sides. It's about, just long enough to get a bed in, and they built that for him. And I'm pretty certain that's Dr. Bean. And then in the back, you look behind the three boys, standing at the very back is John Johnson, the founder of RMBL. And there's so much rich history that we've got multiple photographs from multiple sources a lot of these settings. Okay, the next photograph. So this is Garwood Judd on the left, and I'm pretty certain that's Joe Buzzard there on the right. Behind them is the Mammal Lab. It's one of the buildings that was built in the 1910s. So Dwayne talked about how silver boomed and then they tried to revive mining. We have three of the original buildings from 1879, 1880, Obie Joyful, which was a horse stable, the town hall, which was actually a saloon, and then Swallow's Nest, which was an attorney's building. And then in the 1910s, the Doucette Company out of Ohio tried to revive mining, and they built the Mammal Lab, which is still there, and Ore House, which is still there. So that's Garwood and Joe standing in front of that old building. Okay, so this is the hotel that Dwayne was referring to. They called it the Grant Hotel. I think it was originally the Gothic Hotel, but then when Grant came through, they switched the name. When you look at the original photographs dating back to 1880, it's a beautiful structure. It's got a second floor walkway, but this is 50 years later, and that building has really started to fall into bad shape. I pulled a quote out from one of the diaries. I've got copies of a bunch of different diaries. So Rachel Bradbury, who was there with her family, wrote on August 5th, 1880, "The people of Gothic City felt highly honored by the arrival of General Grant and party. A reception was given at 8:00 p.m., but not one of us in our camp could go." And this is kind of a theme, I think, of RMBL, is this continuity between the mining days and how the biologists that moved in 1928 took over a lot of those existing structures and started to make them their own. And as Dwayne mentioned, it was used for housing. It was also used for a little bit of lab space. One of the historic buildings in the Gothic town site can actually be seen in the background. That's Richard's Cabin, which is up on the hill right behind the hotel. And that was one of the early buildings built by the biologist after 1928, built by a fellow Joe Savoy. I'll show you a photograph of him a little bit later. Jumping forward, in 1978, Scotty Willie, who we invited to the talk and may be here, nominated, she and Bob Willie and several other people who are active at Rumble, nominated the Gothic town site as a National Historic District. Part of this had to do with the mine and the Red Lady. So if we think about what's going on in Crested Butte in that time period, that's right in the middle of the molybdenum sort of controversy. And one of the best molybdenum deposits is not actually the Red Lady just above Crested Butte, but White Rock up Copper Creek and below the Sylvanite is my understanding is a very high quality molybdenum deposit. So they were worried that the mining companies might start coming in and exploring. And so one of the strategies that they adopted was to nominate the Gothic town site as a National Historic District. And because it's a district, they decided to extend that all the way up to Sylvanite, to that mine. Now, the historic designation was never approved, and so it was just nominated for that. Okay. I'm going to talk a little bit about the renovations because I think that was a lot of the focus of the series is sort of the preservation projects. I took over as director in 2000, and one of the projects I inherited was started by Tabor Allison, who was Rumble's director for 3 years before me. And Tabor inherited, Rumble has always been a little bit of a head scratcher for how to make it work. You know, it's located in a pretty extreme environment. Historically, people would be out there for 8 weeks. You've got all these buildings that you got to take care of, but they're hard to generate revenue. So he was thinking creatively about how we might fix up some of those old buildings. And he noticed that there were opportunities with the Colorado Historic Society and the State Historic Fund as a funding source. And the first step in getting funding to renovate a building, whether it's a rehabilitation or a restoration or preservation, is to do a historic assessment. So the Colorado Historic Society funded a historic assessment project that Tabor has started, but he had not finished by the time that I started as director. So I kind of walked into a project that was halfway done. And what a historic structure assessment does is they go in and prepare a report on the physical condition of the building. They provide a little bit of historic context, and then they make a series of recommendations about what should be done for the building. And there were 7 buildings that were being assessed through that assessment. And once that was completed, it allowed us to go back to the State Historic Fund and request support to fix the buildings up. Now, before we could actually go back and get funding, the buildings needed to be designated historic. So while we had assessment funds, the buildings had not been designated historic, and you can get designation, at least when I was doing it, at the county, state, or federal level. And if you remember, back in 1978, we'd been nominated for a historic district, much like Crested Butte is a historic district, but that had never been approved. And so there was nothing that technically that made any of these buildings historic in that sense. And so we went in front of the Gunnison County Historic Preservation Commission or Committee, and we nominated 7 buildings to be historic. And 3 of the buildings we tied to the mining days. And this is the town hall. I pointed this building out earlier. It was originally a saloon. I posted this photograph up on Facebook one time, and one of the ranching families said, "Hey, Dad, look, there you are, getting ready to go out and sort of round up the cattle." So this photograph goes back to the 1950s, but there's still people that are active here in the Gunnison Crested Butte community that were there in that photo back then, which is one of the things I love about the history, just how much continuity there is. One of the other buildings that we designated historic based upon mining is the Swallow's Nest. Here's a photograph going back to 1928, 29, I forget exactly what year, and they lined up all the kids, and they're sitting on the porch of the Grant Hotel or the Gothic Hotel, and then the Swallow's Nest is there in the background, and you can see the old Model T or the old car right behind it. So that was one of the buildings that was nominated historic based upon mining. And also to clarify, in addition to having 3 buildings, and I'm not going to show a photograph of Obie Joyful, which was a horse stable that was built 1879, 1880. We do have 2 buildings that are designated historic that are tied to mining, but they're tied to the revival of mining in the 1910s. And this is the Ore House, which was an assay building. And if you look carefully, if you get a chance to visit that building, you'll see some of the old narrow gauge in front of the building. They used to run ore buckets in there, store it, and then this shows the building sitting up over the East River, and they would bring a lot of the material and ore down to the river and process it. And there's still an old boiler that sits down in the river that's been sitting down there for 100+ years. And there was a chute that would come out of the window, I think the window on the left, so I'm not certain. But that's how they would get the ore down from that building. And then the Mammal Lab is also one of the buildings that dates to the 1910s, and it was an assay building. One of the ways, and what the assayers would do is they would figure out, the miners were out there speculating, they were gathering material, and when they would find something that they thought was worth mining, they would want to know how valuable it was, so how rich was the silver, and so the assayers would do that work for them. And that photograph on the top left, as you're looking at it, is a block that goes all the way down into the ground that sits on its own foundation. And the reason they did that is one of the ways that the assayers would work is they would weigh the material that was brought in. And so they needed to be able to operate their scales so that they wouldn't be disturbed when people were walking around the building. And so that was where they would place their scales to do the assay work. And then the building was converted after Rumble took over in the 1920s to a classroom, and it became the Mammal Lab because that's where they taught the mammalogy course. And you can see a couple students sitting there in the Mammal Lab. Okay. We had 3 buildings that were designated historic that were tied to Rumble's founding. And the building sort of in the top middle is Barclay Cabin. That was built by Harriet Barclay, who started teaching botany at Rumble in 1929, I believe. It might have been 1928. She was a scientist at Tulsa University that was active at Rumble into the 1970s. Rick Williams, who was a student of hers at Tulsa, is the herbarium. So if you have an opportunity to come up and visit our herbarium and you see a scientist working on plant collections, that's Rick. And Rick is one of her students dating back to the 1970s. There on the left is the McLeod Cabin, which is another building that dates to the 1930s, and then Richard's Cabin below that. Up on the top right is a photograph of Joe Savoy. Joe Savoy was a miner from Crested, Butte, and in the 1930s, during the Depression, Rumble hired him to do a lot of, build a lot of the buildings. And you might notice that a lot of the architecture looks very similar. So these are logs with mortar, with the base logs just sort of laid on the ground. Kevin Donovan with MB Builders, who did a lot of our renovations, told me after doing a lot of our projects that he felt like he really got to know Joe Savoy pretty well, because Kevin probably collectively spent, I don't know, 5 or 6 summers just working on Joe Savoy's buildings and thinking about what Joe was thinking about when he was building those structures. So sort of the history, if we think about sort of the Historic Society, 1978, Gothic is proposed for a district that doesn't move forward. 2000, Tabor Allison gets a grant to do a historic assessment. So we do the preparatory work. Now we're going to be eligible to get funding to renovate these cabins, but they have to be designated historic before you're actually eligible to apply. So 2003, I went in front of the county's Historic Preservation Commission, got them designated historic. And then the first project that we did was the town hall. And that's the one I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about. So it's known, if you talk to people in the Rumble community, they call it the town hall. And it wasn't the town hall. John Johnson, who founded Rumble, was very conservative, and he thought that it was bad for Rumble's reputation to have a building of ill repute that was somehow associated with it. So there are photographs, and I can't quite see what's in this window, and I apologize because I wasn't able to go out to Gothic to get my, some of my old slides, but there's plenty of photographic evidence that that was a saloon. So there'd be a big saloon sign up on top. And in fact, when we renovated it, the archaeologists said, they were pretty certain it was being operated as a brothel. And he said, if you look at the design of the building, you can see the stairs over on the right that are in pretty bad shape. And if you look at old photographs and look at those stairs, they kind of come and go. They get built, they get beat up, they disappear, they get rebuilt. But they said you've got a separate entrance. The upstairs design has a very small room that's big enough for a bed, but then a large sitting room. And that inner room had very florid wallpaper that was, on the ceiling, on the walls. And so they said, based upon that design, they would guess it was probably intended to be a brothel. Whether it operated that way or not, he said he had no idea. Interestingly, when they did the renovation, they found several bullets, and you can still see one if you stand in the right spot outside the building and behind it. Someone was shooting a gun from inside that building, and those bullets are still there. Here's another shot of the town hall, and you can see that it's in pretty bad shape. at this time period, and I would date this to the 1950s or 1960s because there's a lab building behind it, and it's after, I think the biologists started running an electric generator and put up their poles and ran the line somewhere in the 1950s, and based upon that other building, you know, it's got that 1950s feeling. You can see that the stairs have disappeared and they're using a ladder. Go down. Okay, so 2000, and shortly after we get it designated historic, we get money to renovate the building. And one of the elements of doing a historic, it was technically a preservation project. And a preservation project is something that preserves the building, but does not restore it back to a specific time and place. And so what you do is you take the existing structure as it is, and you stabilize that to make certain it's got the appropriate foundation, the electrical system isn't going to burn that down, but it's not really an attempt to bring it back to a specific year, or a specific period. So we got a grant to do this preservation project, and part of these projects is you bring an archaeologist out to look at the situation and make certain there's not a significant archaeological find. And the little shed right there in the back is something I want you to take a close look at, because this triggers a fascinating story when the archaeologist comes out. So the archaeologist comes out once you've opened the sort of the ground up. And the way we would do these projects, all of these buildings, is typically they would elevate the building, get it up off the ground, put a foundation or some kind of footer in to stabilize the foundation, get the rotting logs off of the ground. Often we ended up replacing the wood that's close to the ground because it would rot as the snow would accumulate. And here what I'm showing is the back of the building after the old shed has been removed. Now they numbered all of the boards and all that, and so they're going to rebuild that shed as much as they can, but they've taken it down, and the archaeologist has come out and he digs a little bit of those test pits. I'm sitting over in my office, I get bored, I sort of walk out, and you see the archaeologist out there. And maybe a week later, after the archaeologist does his visit, he calls me up, or she, I forget, and the archaeologist says, it's a significant archaeological site. And I said, okay. I said, what do we do? He says, well, we don't know. We've never had a significant archaeological site on one of these projects before. So I said, well, you're the expert. Help me figure out what the next step is. So, he hangs up, he makes some phone calls, and he calls back and says, okay, we have a plan, and we've got a little bit of extra funding. We're going to go in and do a full-on archaeological dig. And he said, we think what happened is that shed got built a year or two after the main building, and Gothic and Rumble being what it is, no one had ever picked those boards up and looked at it since they'd laid those boards down. So when they pulled those boards up, they discovered a site that they could date to, directly to 1881, 1882, whenever it was built and was sort of in active use. And they were excited because they thought what was going on, and you can see the door there in the bottom, in the back of the building. He said, we think that the miners, and if you get to Kachevers or some of the Crested Butte bars, you can kind of appreciate this. They said, we think that the miners were hanging out drinking in the saloon and then eating dinner, or, eating appetizers or whatever, and just throwing their bones out the back door. And then what happened is that they built that shed and just covered up that site. And so they said, we think we're going to get an understanding of what those miners were eating. And this is after they'd done the original dig, but before they hadn't really analyzed it. They just said, we got a lot of bones. And so we think we're going to learn what the miners were eating for dinner. So they go off, they spend a number of months sort of analyzing things. And we have tons of bags with this stuff, because part of dealing with an archaeological site is you need to maintain the material but with the federal archaeological requirements, so much material is generated. The museums, at least at the time, are full, so no one wanted to take it. So we still have it on our archives. And this is just a subset of the list. So we have pages and pages where they went through and they made a list of everything that they found. And, I categorized this. They found a lot of old stuff, a lot of nails, glass, marbles. It goes on and on for pages. Okay, it starts to get more interesting. They found a lot of animal fragments. And this is why they thought they were going to figure out what the miners were eating. But they worked with mammalogists, and they started identifying what it was that the fragments were from. And they weren't necessarily animals that you would think that miners would be eating late at night. So probable wolf, coyote, cow. You could imagine they're eating cow for dinner. Skunk, not the best dinner food. Raccoon, yellow-bellied marmots, pine martens. So a lot of fragments from animals, and not necessarily the kind of fragments that you would associate with a late night dinner. The weirdest, so they found a lot of stuff. They found a lot of animal fragments. They found a vial, and I'm going to read this. Included within the faunal assemblage of the Gothic town hall is a small vial containing several preserved embryos. Given the unique nature of the vial, its contents were not included in the faunal database, so the osteological data from the site was not skewed. Osteological meaning bone data. Utilizing an atlas for staging mammalian and chick embryos, it was possible to identify the contents of the vial without opening it. Based on the 2 exposed embryos in the vial, the contents are that of 6 mouse embryos of approximately 14 days in age. The yellow coloration and good preservation of the contents suggests that the vial was once filled with a fixative preservative, probably a formaldehyde compound. So the archaeologist calls me up, and they're just completely confused because they said, this is not what we expected in trying to figure out what the miners were eating. And I said, well, I'm not an archaeologist and I don't know a lot, but I said, it sounds to me like what you have is a mammal collection. And I said, Rumble got founded in 1928. And so, this is a mammal collection that we can date to, Rumble's founding. And they said, no. They said, the vial, the bone material, all of this, we're going to peg 1882, 1883. So we had a mystery, which was that we had discovered a mammal collection that we dated to the mining days, and it would have been almost 40 years before the founding of Rumble. So now we're scratching our head. How does a mammal collection get under this shed 40 years before the biology laboratory is founded? Next step, Rick Richard, biologist and mammologist. He was a faculty member down at Western in the 1970s. I don't know if Dwayne overlapped with him or knew him, but he had taken mammalogy in Rumble in the 1950s. I don't think Rick is in this photograph, but this is Bob Enders, who is an old scientist who started teaching up in Gothic after World War II, and he's teaching on the deck of the Mammal Lab, one of our old buildings that got converted from mining to mammalogy. So I called up Rick, and I said, Rick, I got a mammal collection. It looks like it's about 40 years older than Rumble is. And so I have no clue. Maybe being a mammologist, as someone who's been hanging out in Gothic and since the 1950s, thinking about mammalogy. And he's like, absolutely. He said, that's E.R. Warren. He said, I'm like, who's E.R. Warren? So then E.R. Warren, Edward Royal Warren, this is the paper written by David Armstrong, who documented E.R. Warren. So E.R. Warren graduated from MIT in 1881, and that winter he came to Colorado with his father, a physician, to study mineral assaying at Colorado College. In May 1882, the Warrens, father and son, went to Gothic, Gunnison County, where the younger Warren established himself as an engineering consultant in the silver fields. He went on to write the first Mammals of Colorado book in 1910. Better than that, Rick says, not only do you know who it was, I said, I know where his diary is. He says, let me track it down. So, I forget whether it was a couple weeks or a month or was that winter, he shows up with the original diary from E.R. Warren. And he's got stacks of notes on beaver dams in Gunnison County in the 1920s. And I'm going to read just a little bit. And this is what we did was we transcribed sort of the main parts of his diary relevant to Rumble. And then we put the original materials in the archives at the University of Colorado Boulder, because David Armstrong, who was a mammologist that followed up 1980s, taught out in Gothic, faculty member out at University of Colorado, he pulled E.R. Warren's archival material together and put it there. So we sent the diary on with the rest of the material. So this is speaking E.R. Warren's words, and I think he's writing this diary a little retrospectively. It was on the morning of the 9th of May, 1882, so that would have been about 5 days ago, that Father and I left Colorado Springs for Gothic, Gunnison County. Crested Butte was a pretty flourishing town in those days, where besides the coal mining, there was considerable silver mining and prospects going in the tributary region. There were numerous stores in the place, to say nothing of the saloons, which did a flourishing business. We spent the night in the Elk Mountain House, walking down town in the evening. I guess everybody who saw us spotted us for tenderfeet. I remember years afterwards, old V.F. Axtell, whom I came to know very well, told me that he remembered very well seeing us walking about. He was a member of the firm of Holt and Axtell, storekeepers, lumbermen, real estate dealers, pioneers in the region. Just a little excerpt for the Crested Butte fans. Okay, still talking about his diary. So I'm reading from his words. After we had reached Gothic, we began to look about for a place for me to set up in business. Fletcher had preceded us and helped me to get acquainted. The question of an office was settled by my renting the back room in a building belonged to the town company. It had formerly been used by an assayer, and there was an attached shed in the rear for my furnace. Soon after I arrived, a young fellow named Stan Grenendike rented part of the front room for a news, cigar, and stationery store. He also acted as operator for the Gunnison, Crested Butte, and Grand River Telegraph Company, a company which had a line extending to Schofield and Elko, several miles beyond Gothic, and also one from Gothic via Pearl Pass to Ashcroft and Aspen. It never did much business. So we went from this old preservation project and pulling up that shed, bringing archaeologists out, to discovering bone fragments, to figuring out where those bone fragments came from, and then actually getting a description of E.R. Warren moving into the building in his own words. We finished the project there in 2004 on beautiful stairs. Those stairs are still there. So this is, 16 years later. As far as I can tell, when you look at the old photographs, those stairs have probably lasted longer, because any stairs I see in a photograph tend to be gone within 5 or 10 years when you see the next set of stairs. Kevin Donovan with MB Builders, who's a longtime resident, came out to take classes at Rumble in the early 1970s. He was Billy Barr's roommate, so they actually slept in that room when they were students in the early 1970s. Kevin said that the tourists would walk up and look in those old windows when he and Billy were sleeping there on the floor. So Kevin went on to become a general contractor and worked in Gunnison County, and he oversaw that renovation. And then Jay Miller, who is another builder, worked on that project with Kevin, and that's the grand opening. And then I'm not going to talk about the other projects, but I thought I would just show you a couple sort of key highlights. So there's the Mammal Lab. One of the challenges we had, and I'm going to finish up here so there's time for questions, was that these buildings were not designed structurally to stay up. So when you look at the bottom left, you see they're using plywood to create a little bit of structural integrity for torquing. They did exactly the same thing on the town hall, and there was a period of time during the renovation when there was plywood running a diagonal that covered the whole building, and someone stomped into my office, a tourist, and just said, "I cannot believe what you've done to this building. You've converted it to this plywood diagonal. What are you thinking?" And I guess they didn't understand that they were still in the process of putting all of the original planking back up after numbering it. Then on the right, as you're looking at that, that's the window of the swallow's nest. And those windows actually became a pretty interesting feature. That building was built for a lawyer, And so he spent a lot of time in making it nicer because he wanted to project himself as a professional. So they had this really beautiful shape to the top of the window, and they spent a lot of time figuring out how to recreate that. And they also used that whitewash, which had a little bit of acidity that meant a lot of that original wood facing south ended up dissolving. And then on the top left is the ore house, and I'm showing the stairs. When I sort of, with these projects, I didn't really do anything useful other than get funding and figure out how to set them up. And occasionally I would get pulled in because there would be some problem, and usually the problem would involve stairs. So how you could get these stairs preserved to meet code while not undermining the structural integrity. And what I came to realize, having done, I think, 7 of these preservation projects, that any project is a negotiation between 3 parties. The past, right? So it's a historic preservation, and so the past is an important part of the project. The current, which is how that building is going to be used, and then the building code, which is safety. And so anytime you hit some sticky problem, you get there with the builder and the architect, and you just sit there and you talk over and over, what's the way to balance safety with current use in historic preservation? And a lot of those discussions stemmed around the stairs. So I'm going to stop there, giving you a lot of material. I could talk for days, weeks even, but I think it's a fun little story and be happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you, Ian. I love that story about the mammal collection. It's not very often that you get to actually connect so many pieces of the story and, discover the history behind it. We do have some questions to start out with. Barbara Mason asked, is Clea Grewald one of the kids in the photo with the big group photo? Is Clea in there?
I'm a little fuzzy because I believe Clea was born either 1928 or 1929. And when I got to know Clea, sometimes she was much older and sometimes the stories started changing a little bit. And so at one point she told me she was in the womb the lab's first year, but then I think she might have been born in 1927. So if she's in that photo, she would be being held as a baby.
Okay. Shelley Popke asks, were any of the buildings in Gothic moved to Crested Butte the way that buildings in Irwin were?
I don't know. I've gotten really good at knowing the Gothic buildings, but I never really keep track of them after they leave Gothic. We had one building leave Gothic last fall. Crystal Building, I think, is going to show up somewhere by Horse Ranch Park. So I do know that the buildings continue to migrate, and a number of the buildings that we have in Gothic have migrated in. I think Crystal actually migrated in from somewhere else about 50 years ago before it migrated out. So I'd love to know if anybody finds history of an old Gothic building here in Crested Butte. I'd love to know that fact.
Next question from Betsy Hartfield. Is the Gothic Hotel Grand Hotel still standing?
Technically, no, but I would say symbolically and metaphorically it is, because when the scientists built a lot of their structures in the late 1920s and early 1930s, not only was there no hardware store in Crested Butte, but there's probably something, but it wasn't easy to get back and forth. So what they did was they scavenged a lot of the old material. So there are a number of structures, including Bean Pod that I referred to, that are built from the wood from the old Grant Hotel and some of the other buildings. So the wood is still there, even though the Grant Hotel is not. And if you look in front of the town hall, the visitor center, there is an old safe, and that safe, I believe, came originally from the Grant Hotel, used in the 1940s and 50s as a place where Dorothy and Chris Johnson stored their milk, because there was an old spring that would bubble up there, and that's how they kept the milk cold.
Cool. Question from Lynn Martin. Is it possible to tour or visit these buildings without disrupting Rumble's summer work and the students?
Yeah, absolutely. Every fall, we do a historic preservation dinner, and we do a tour. So we kind of do a dinner, a little bit of a celebration, and then we walk around. And then we're always sort of happy to do private tours. This summer is unfortunately not the best summer to bring the public up, but when we get a chance, I'd be happy to do it. And that was Lynn, is that right? That asked that question?
Yes, it was Lynn.
And I got to mention, so, and maybe she doesn't want me to mention this, but her family, the Beardsley family, O.S. Beardsley had a mining claim up on Sheep Mountain. And then I want to say it was 3 or 4 generations behind when OS had a blacksmith shop there in Gothic, not too far from my office. And the family sort of generously donated a mining claim up on Sheep Mountain. And so that family is one of the families that have brought stories back to Gothic and has continued to sort of help us enrich the history.
It's so important to have those first-person stories. Were you going to say something, Dwayne?
No, I'm just listening. I've learned a lot from Ian. I've taken a lot of notes. It was great to be on the other side.
Next question from Ryan Cadenhead. Are there other buildings in Gothic still in need of renovation?
Yeah, I would say most of them. There was a new one we opened last fall that I think is still in pretty good shape. But we've been scratching our heads. There are buildings, I think they have to be 50 years old to be designated historic. And we don't plan on preserving all of them, but we would like to preserve representatives from each of the time periods in Gothic. And so these little cabins that we call it Happy Valley. So Happy Valley, if you've gone out to Gothic in the winter and stayed at the Maroon Hut, there are little cabins below it. And those cabins date to the 1930s. And we have not yet designated one of those buildings historic, and we haven't done a preservation project. And it's too much to preserve all of those, but we probably would like to do one of those because it represents a time and a use that captures Rumble's history. So I was a little facetious about them all needing preservation, but that would probably be one of the next steps if we did a technical preservation project.
Okay. Next question. Why did Grant visit Gothic? I'm assuming President Grant.
Yeah, I'm probably...
Go ahead. I can take a shot at that. Grant was president from 1869 to 1877. And at that time, he began to work on his memoirs. And a little bit later on, after 1880, he developed throat cancer and barely got him finished, but he always wanted to go out west. And the interesting thing about Grant is that when he came in to the Gunnison country in 1880, there was no railroad, so he had to come by Barlow and Sanderson stage. And when he got to Gunnison, he was with ex-governor John Rout and present governor Frederick Pitkin, and they hired a mule wagon. And Grant came up, and the story was that Grant, when he was traveling that way, never wanted anybody else to drive, so he drove. And they were in Irwin, and there was a well-known story about a possible assassination attempt in Irwin, which is kind of a long, involved story, but it was a legitimate try. And from there, he came through Crested, Butte, and into Gothic, and on out to Schofield. When he was in Gothic, he got in a poker game, and a lot of the people at the poker game tried to lose hands to him so they could, give him some shares. They'd pay him off in shares in Gothic mines, and then they could say that ex-President Grant owned shares in the Sylvanite or some of the other nearby mines. And then Grant went out through the north end, and he died shortly thereafter of throat cancer. But he always wanted to be in the West. I hope that answers it.
Yeah. We've got a question from Cindy Petito. Has there been any other excavating in the Gothic area? With the large population back in the 1880s, you'd think other spots might have hidden treasures.
Yeah, the Gothic town site has been pretty well picked over. One man's trash is another man's treasure. So it's always sort of hard to know, what the line is between picking up material. each year the ground turns over with the snow and the frost heave. And so if you walk the paths, like I think they open the road to Gothic tonight, we'll go out and walk the paths, and there'll be old glass sort of spewed all over from when they were just throwing bottles out there. A number of years ago, we found almost a perfect Budweiser, I think it was a Budweiser bottle that probably came from St. Louis and was bottled with beer down in Gunnison. I believe Scotty Willie a number of years ago found a $20 gold piece up by the Orr House. Clea told me that she liked to, when she was younger and probably too young, so I want to say like 10 or 11, she would go hang out in the stables and smoke cigarettes. And unfortunately, she burned one of the buildings down. I'm sure she told that story, but maybe not for, until someone like me came along 50 years later. And I'm pretty certain it was an old trashed out site that we cleaned up maybe 10 years ago because it was just full of old boards with nails and stuff like that. I don't know that there are any more significant archaeological sites. We do have an archaeologist come in every time we do one of these projects. When we took down the old Crystal Cabin about a year ago, we had an archaeologist come in. We do ground disturbance, often we do archaeology, and we just haven't found any kind of pristine sites like what we found on the shed.
Okay. Oh, Clea. Hedda Peterson asks, what types of design considerations are taken into account when new buildings are constructed?
Could you ask that question again? What kind of design features?
What types of design considerations are taken into account when new buildings are constructed?
Yeah, so with the new buildings, we've tried to maintain a lot of the look of the old buildings. So if you look at the new buildings, they're very similar in terms of having sort of those gable ends, relatively simple structures. Crystal Cabin, which we built last year, the new Crystal, it looks like it's got the board and batten. So the old buildings, so Joe Savoy would do the logs with the mortar, and then sometime in the 30s and the 40s, that might have been a little too much for the biologists that built the buildings, and so they went to a board and batten approach. And board and batten is a terrible thing for keeping mice out because the boards just start warping and there are all these little seams. So for the design of the new buildings, the board and batten doesn't make any sense, but we still have sort of done the buildings in a way that it looks like board and batten that has visual continuity. So we try to maintain a lot of the look while allowing Gothic to continue to evolve. The Gothic Research Center, which is probably the most modern building, it's made of metal, but it looks like wood, and it has a number of features which sort of harken back to the mining days, including sort of the big tower where we've got the solar panels, which is the kind of structure you would see in mining. And so there's kind of like visual elements that establish continuity, and if you don't look too closely, it might feel a little bit like mining or feel a little bit like the original buildings. The Gothic Dining Hall, the Billy Barr Community Center, it's a very large building, and we were very concerned about the mass. And so what the architect did was they actually broke that up into what looks like several of Rumble's old buildings with the gables. So they reduced the look of the mass of the building, even though it's very large. And it actually parallels, when you look at the Mammal Lab behind it, it's got a very similar sort of look to it with the roof line.
All right. We've got just two more questions. This one's from Stuart Bailey. Any information about where the Gothic Butte Hill might be?
The Butte Hill?
Gothic Butte Hill.
Cemetery.
So there's a reference that Rachel Bradbury, I read that quote, and she was there, I think, in 1880 when Grant came through. And a little bit earlier in the diary, in early July, one of the members of their party died, and they buried them there in the Gothic cemetery. And there are no directions given or any reference. I've seen another reference to an aspen grove just south of Gothic, which unfortunately, if you've spent much time looking at those hills, there are lots of aspen groves south of Gothic. Every 5 years or so, there's someone who shows up from somewhere, and they're looking for the Gothic cemetery, and I'll go back and sort of check my notes, and I've never found anything other than Aspen Grove somewhere south of Gothic. And Stuart probably has more information than I do because he's been out there longer.
And our last question actually rounds back to our first question about Clea Greenewalt being in the photograph. Barbara Mason asks if we take a look at that, is she the second kid in the photo?
I think that's probably, yeah, I think that is probably Clea.
Cool.
And I think the photograph might be 1929. I got a bunch of photographs 2 years ago that dated to a high school teacher and her family that came through in 29. And I think that's from that collection. You can see the two twins sitting there in the middle. And then I think that's Chris between Clea and the twins. And then some of the other kids that were there with the families.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dwayne. Thank you, Ian, for joining us for the first in our National Preservation Month speaker series. We really appreciate you guys being here. I know as the museum is learning a lot, and we're really glad that we can take this opportunity to be able to share this great information. I just want to remind everybody that if you'd like to register for the next in our series, it's all about the Denver and Rio Grande Depot in Crested, Butte, and Molly Miniman and Jesse Early are going to be joining us for that one, so that one should be pretty interesting. If you'd like to find out more information about what we're up to, we're also doing a living history initiative where we're collecting stories from all the voices here in Crested Butte and the Gunnison Valley to preserve this moment in time and how our community is moving through a world event at a local level. And once again, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Ian, and thank you, Dwayne.
Ian, thanks a million. I learned a lot.
I always learn from you too, Dwayne.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Nell. That was great.
Thank you.
Keep up the good work.
Thank you. We'll see you all next time.
You bet.